If you've watched this channel for a long time, you may know that back during COVID, I got bored and decided to make a video where I did brief reviews on every James Bond film. It was pretty fun to make back in the day, and it was basically a turbo flop for the huge amount of work that went into the project and the fact that I watched like 30 films for it. It would also be the template for the eventual DCEU video I'm coming close to completing. I just blew up the format quite a bit. While I went through Spectre, I released that video a few months before James Bond's return, or grand finale, in No Time to Die. Since the film has released, I've given it a handful of watches, and it's always one where I say, I should really do that sometime. Then I would keep pushing it off, not because of anything against the film, and not even because my original Bond video came out to little fanfare, but merely because, well, this movie's kinda long. I saw it twice in theaters, and once right when I got the Blu-ray, and thought, meh, I'll do it in a few months. Never got around to it till now. Anyhow, just a hair under 3 years later, I finally dusted off my 4K copy. I got the upgrade in a red box, and naturally I thought it was pretty good still. No Time to Die is James Bond star Daniel Craig's final film as the titular spy, with his tenure being the longest consecutive run on the characters at 15 years. Though Sean Connery did return for a late-stage non-MGM or Ion sequel after 12 years, following the end of his run, technically making him play James Bond across 21 years. That's a long story, so watch my reviews of the other films if you want an explanation on all that. Regardless, Bond film production started to slow down around this time, with Craig making 5 Bond films that were all fairly awkwardly spaced. It's not like the Roger Moore days where they would push out one of these films every 2 years. This meant Craig more than once considered retirement before this film. This is also on top of the fact that these films are time-consuming, action and stunt-heavy, and huge corporate products with large media press tours. In other words, being James Bond is a massive pain in the ass for the actor who takes on the role. Problem was, James Bond's story under Daniel Craig was also a cohesive narrative. They kept opening new plot threads and calling back to old ones. This was much different than the soft continuity the James Bond series previously had to deal with, which treated continuity as fast and loose, making it so anyone could catch any Bond film in pretty much any order, and it'll work out okay. Not so much an option with Craig's version, however. Anyhow, despite Craig saying he'd rather slash his wrists than do another James Bond film, he was somehow convinced. That said, this film was clearly intended to be a wrap-up with the title No Time to Die chosen, a bit of a play on the On Her Majesty's Secret Service quote, "We have all the time in the world," before Tracy Bond's death. We may be getting ahead of ourselves a bit though. Production on the film started in 2016, not long after the release of its predecessor, Spectre. Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, longtime James Bond screenwriters, mapped out the film. They had worked on Bond since the Brosnan era and worked on all of the Daniel Craig films up to this point. The initial plan in the quest for a director was to bring back Sam Mendes, but he bowed out of directing after Skyfall and Spectre. The studio eyed Christopher Nolan, who turned the project down, as his work is usually original, bar his Batman films, which were unique takes on the characters, and he hasn't really been known to do any mid-series films like this. Denis Villeneuve was considered, but he bowed out due to his work on the Dune films that would also fight the COVID pandemic to release. We'll of course come back to this in a second here. Trainspotting director Danny Boyle came on with a fresh script, but ended up leaving the project shortly after in 2018, with the studio finally hiring director Cary Funke to helm the film. He is best known for helming and directing the first season of True Detective for HBO before coming onto this project. Purvis and Wade, who left scriptwriting duties during Danny Boyle's short term as the project head, returned to rewrite the script with some assistance from Paul Haggis, who wrote Casino Royale along with them. Daniel Craig got Phoebe Waller-Bridger to join in to help as well, to help make the female characters reflect the time, with her view that Bond didn't really need to change his ways as a struggling ladies' man, but that he needed to be more realistically explored, and the women he was with also needed to act a little more realistic and make more sense from a script writing standpoint. As for James Bond's death, oops, spoiler alert, this is the first time Bond has died in one of these films. Reason being is, as I stated, these films were very episodic up till Craig's run, which was the first hard reboot of the Bond franchise, and one which, wanted to explore Bond deeper, meaning more consequences and transferring story arcs. Craig said from the time of Casino Royale he wanted his Bond to eventually die and have a hard transfer to the next Bond in the franchise, something Barbara Broccoli was on board with, surprisingly, considering how protective her and her father have been of their golden goose since the film started over half a century ago, with the team ultimately deciding the play was to have him killed in a giant death weapon, which happened to work out well with their plague plotline setup, though at one point they considered having him being shot by a random shooter at some point to show the randomness of death and the fact that James Bond may defy impossible odds over and over again, but one day he simply wouldn't. Fukunaga, perhaps rightfully, shot the idea down, as it wouldn't have been an incredibly narratively satisfying way for Bond to die after 5 films, or in a more macro sense, 25 films at this point. Most of the cast of Spectre returned in their respective parts. This includes Léa Seydoux, who would be the first Bond girl to return for a second installment as the love interest. A few other notable actors were added in smaller roles, but I think the most notable additions were Lashana Lynch, who played the new 007, and Rami Malek, who would play the final villain of this series. Christoph Waltz was not expected to return as Blofeld until the first trailer for No Time to Die launched, with the actor even denying it in 2017. Though his part is fairly small in the film, so perhaps at the time he really was under the impression that he wouldn't be coming back. The film started shooting in April 2019 and took most of the year to complete, with pickups being shot up till December. The film faced more challenges as it continued into release, with Eon actually having an opportunity to change distribution partners this time around, though they stuck with MGM and United Artists in North America. They dropped Sony as their global distribution partner, though, in favor of Universal, who would also do the DVD, Blu-ray, and 4K release. Originally, when Danny Boyle was set to direct, the plan was to release No Time to Die in November of 2019, before production delays and a director shift pushed it back to February 2020, and finally April 2020. Well, April wasn't the final release date because, unbeknownst to the production crew, these small delays managed to edge it right into the front of the COVID-19 pandemic and many of the world governments taking the old stay at home for months and hope it goes away camp. Regardless, Eon said, well, that sucks, but November 2020 is far enough away that this will all clear up and the theater business will be ripe and ready for James Bond by November. It was not. You see, Christopher Nolan made a Bond-esque trippy time-reversing thing in Tenet, and the director put it upon himself to save the industry, with him jumping in first, dropping his film in September for a staggered world release. I was running a theater at that point and we reopened our doors, which was a huge pain in the ass, and no one ever came. Eventually, in a bid to get the kids to come, they added an exclusive Travis Scott music video to the start of the film that was set to twice the volume of the film and shook my desk like it was a fucking earthquake. Problem with that is only grumpy old people wanted to risk their lives against COVID to see the film, so they would all complain about it to me. Regardless, Tenet made a respectable enough $365 million on a budget of $205 million, which probably means it didn't make money, or it didn't make the money they wanted it to make, because theaters reclosed, and so James Bond's November 2020 release was at best not viable, and at worst not possible. Regardless, Eon, MGM, and Universal didn't want to put the movie out in those conditions, so it went back on the shelf for a little bit. That isn't the end of the bad news, though. No Time to Die had to be a hit. A Bond marketing campaign is very expensive, so they had already put around $60 million into marketing the movie by the time the film was shelved in March 2020. That means, with everything going on in the world, that $60 million was ostensibly wasted, since a new marketing campaign would need to come out to get an accurate release date, and also keep the general public, who aren't necessarily super fans of Bond or people who don't closely follow the film world, to know that it's coming out at all. The film was pushed back to April 2021, about a year after the pandemic release date, but again got pushed further to October 2021, though in the UK the release was moved up a bit to September. Eventually though, after tons of delays, slate shufflings, and tens of millions of dollars burned, No Time to Die finally released in theaters, and fans finally got to see the finale of Daniel Craig's impressive run on James Bond. The film starts on a young Madeline Swan having an average day with her alcoholic mom until a mysterious masked man shows up and kills her mother, with Madeline narrowly escaping. This turns out to be Lucifer Safin, who from now on we'll call Safin because I'll never pronounce that first name the same way twice and likely never pronounce it correctly either. Regardless, Safin's family had been murdered by Madeline's father, Mr. White, on the orders of Blofeld. To recap, Mr. White has been a through-line antagonist between each of Craig's Bond films, being responsible for many of the events in these films, including the death of James's first love, Vesper. Regardless, the film hops forward to somewhere a bit after Spectre, but still 5 years before the main events of the film. Madeline and Bond are on a trip to Matera, and though the trip seems romantic, Bond obviously has an exterior motive, and he visits the grave of his first flame, Vesper. However, the shrine explodes and Bond is injured, forced to fight a group of Spectre mercenaries, and surmising that Madeline must have betrayed him, much like Vesper had. James Bond shuts himself off from Madeline and quits MI6, flying off to live a quiet life in Jamaica, which naturally couldn't last long as Bond's American counterpart, Felix Leiter, fills him in on the recent theft of Project Hercules, a nanobot that can graft onto people's DNA and basically act as a human kill switch. Bond ends up joining the mission in part out of spite that his 007 codename had been passed on to a new agent, Nomi, which prideful Bond couldn't accept. Bond heads to Cuba to infiltrate a party that was said to be able to get him information on Project Hercules. However, the party was a Spectre setup designed to kill Bond, the only issue being Safin had a double agent in place that used nanobots to kill the Spectre members, but sparing Bond. Bond manages to catch the double agent Ash, who Bond had fought on Matera, but Ash isn't one to be easily defeated, and he manages to kill Felix and escape. Now, with the death of his longtime ally and friend Felix, Bond is hellbent on getting to the bottom of this and figure out who is pulling the strings. This led him to Blofeld, who is only willing to talk if he can talk with Madeline present. Bond isn't happy about this, A, because of their past relationship, and B, because she's the daughter of a top Spectre agent who evidently has lots of access to Blofeld, the man Bond still thinks is calling the shots on this whole thing. Unbeknownst to anyone, Madeline had met with the masked man from her childhood who gives her a dose of nanobots that would kill Blofeld, but despite considering the assassination, she backs out at the last minute, though James, through brief contact with Madeline, has the virus on him now. James meets with Blofeld, who gloats that he was the one who bombed Vesper's grave and set up Madeline, knowing that even if Bond survived, he would blame Madeline for what happened. Bond attempts to strangle Blofeld, but relents. However, the nanobots Bond received on his hand made contact with Blofeld and were designed to kill him. Anyhow, Bond finally apologizes to Madeline and learns that since the events of Matera, Madeline had a daughter, Matilda, who Madeline denies is his.
Okay, the blue eyes.
She's not yours.
Madeline shows Bond all the intel that Mr. White had gathered on Safin and his family's private island that Safin has begun harvesting Hercules nanobots out of. Before Bond and Madeline can make any sort of plan, however, the pair is attacked. Bond tells Madeline to hide with her daughter while Bond sorted things out. Bond gets revenge on Ash for killing Felix, but Matilda and Madeline are captured by Safin. Bond returns to London and recruits Nomi to help him infiltrate Safin's base and save Madeline and Matilda before calling an airstrike that will destroy the facility before the nanotech can be distributed and cause further damage to the world. Bond meets with Safin, who does a classic Bond monologue before escaping with Matilda in a trap he set up for Bond. Obviously, Bond finds his way out. Bond manages to find Madeline, and eventually Matilda, who found a spot to hide away from Safin and his team, at which point he sends the pair off the island and takes off. Bond is ambushed by Safin, who infects him with nanites that would kill Madeline and Matilda if Bond was ever to see them again. Bond kills Safin and heads to open the island's missile silos, which will allow the airstrike to destroy the virus, though it's too late for Bond to escape. He calls Madeline and Matilda and confesses that he loves them and that's why he can't go back, and Madeline is like, "It's your kid." And Bond, along with the audience, is like, Yeah, no shit, dude. Anyways, Bond blows up and everyone's sad, the end. No Time to Die has a surprisingly tight cast as far as it goes, with each character arc deepening from previous appearances in the franchise. James Bond starts the film still grieving the death of Vesper years after her death, which is why he goes to her grave to attempt to get some closure. Of course, her initial betrayal during the events of Casino Royale seemed to still affect Bond, because after Spectre's assassination attempt, Bond pretty easily assumed Madeline, like Vesper before, had betrayed him, so he parted ways with her in MI6 to live on an island in Jamaica.
How will I know that you're okay?
You won't. I'll never see me again.
By the time Felix showed up, Bond didn't take much convincing to be pulled back in. Despite some initial resistance, he was pissed and Nomi took the 007 mantra in his slight self-obsessed head, assuming they would retire the number like a sports star or something. Bond goes through a lot of emotions through this film, and I think the idea of the film is to, in part, have him feel his age. Felix, his counterpart from the CIA, is killed, caught off guard, and ended. This kind of mirrors the idea of Bond's death when he was supposed to be shot in the pitch meetings. Felix got through these situations 100 times as well, but not this time. Perhaps that sets up some sense of mortality in Bond, but admittedly I think the film could have played with this idea a little more to ramp up more to his death at the end of the film. Bond eventually realizes Madeline didn't do anything and was being foolish, but when he meets their child, he is initially not fighting that hard to prove if it's his kid or not, playing at the face value and just kind of bonding with the child passively on accident, perhaps seeing what he could have if he only could finish this last mission. Of course, Bond gets infected, which means he'll never be able to live on and see Matilda or Madeline, and if he makes contact with someone who makes contact with them, they could still die. The only way to protect Madeline and Matilda is basically for Bond to literally get obliterated on the island, as set up in the film. Safin's last act of vengeance, as he was beaten, was minimally to ruin Madeline's family this way, but we'll come back to that. Bond, by this point, is at peace with dying, and despite the other characters acting like Bond had a chance to get free, this time he knew he was cooked, and he died standing up. I like Bond's arc, but I think some things could have been expanded a bit. His relationship with Madeline reflects Bond and Tracy Bond's in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, with Bond even saying the "we have all the time in the world" line.
We have all the time in the world.
We have all the time in the world.
And the pair being separated, though in a different context. After that, the pair don't interact until a fair bit later when Bond learns Blofeld set the whole thing up. Like, that's cool, but why did Madeline so easily take him back when he split without any notice and with no chance to explain? And she just has to be a single parent to his kid for years? I wish there was more of a ramp up, perhaps some residual like coldness for more than the one scene that there's kind of some residual coldness. But I think Bond's pseudo-sacrifice during the climax was sweet. Madeline Swan is the second lead, being, as I stated, the first Bond girl with a full-blown pull-through arc, being the leading woman across 2 consecutive films. Madeline is Mr. White's daughter, and after the death of Safin's family by Mr. White, Safin wants revenge on the family. Madeline has so far escaped this vengeance for the most part, following her escape, but Safin has always been around Madeline, keeping an eye on her to eventually exact his revenge. Madeline is a protective mother who is incredibly loyal to Bond and her service, even after what happened with James during the intro. She even backed out from assassinating Blofeld, even when she was at risk of Safin's retaliation, and ultimately she would just be killing Blofeld, an incredibly evil man who very few would miss. Her arc is very light in this film. We understand her values and kind of see her rectify with Bond, but I wouldn't say she has a super major arc. She's very functional, being stuck between Bond and Safin though, and I think it kind of creates an interesting dynamic between Bond and Safin, even though it's a bit secondhand. Safin is a man on a revenge quest after the death of his family. He killed Mr. White's wife, and attempted to murder Madeline too, and bitterly worked from the shadows up until this film when he organized the destruction of Spectre. After that, the only thing he had left to do was ruin Madeline's life and use his nanite machines to hold the world hostage. Nothing too groundbreaking for the most part, honestly. The nanites are perhaps a modern version of the villain stealing nukes or shooting a laser and destroying cities and so on and so forth, but the personal relationship with Madeline is what I suppose makes him more unique, and even facing his death, his final move of infecting Bond to keep him away from Madeline was a pretty strong ending point for the villain.
Now we are both poisoned with heartbreak. Two heroes in a tragedy of our own making.
Again though, I wish there was just more with him. He is the final villain of this era, and I think he's just a hair undercooked when compared to other villains, even in the Craig era. I like his design though, it's pretty cool at the very least and pretty memorable. Nomi is the new 007, and she's pretty much just a utility character, though she kind of mirrors the arc Bond had in Casino Royale. She's young, cocky, and thinks she's invincible. She in a lot of ways reflects that kind of cocky attitude for Bond, and they have a slight rivalry over who is the true 007. She helps Bond during the events of the film, namely the infiltration of Safin's island, and I think she's pretty solid. I get what they were going for. This is the new generation and Bond is the old, being pulled out and replaced, as she soon will be one day as well. It's just the nature of the beast in life and the spy game as well, and it's kind of fun seeing Nomi in the same position Daniel Craig was in the original Casino Royale film. Q and Moneypenny are back working as Bond's kind of support when he was rogue, since this operation is off the books, as M had some involvement in the Nanite project earlier on, thinking of it as a safe and covert way to easily dispatch targets that eventually fell in the wrong hands, making M kind of have to cover the agency's ass and keep away from the fight on this one. Felix and Blofeld are back and kind of round out their stories and add some function to the narrative. The main plot of this film wasn't orchestrated by Spectre, with Safin's killing of Spectre organization happening pretty early on, and eventually Blofeld's death. So for this film at least, Safin has sat in the seat of the big bad for the universe until Bond and his gang dispatched of that threat. Felix, on the other hand, is meant to kind of set the tone for Bond's mortality, as I said earlier, with him dying on the boat fairly early on in the film. Logan, Ash, and Primo are the henchmen in this film. Ash has a cyborg eye that allowed Blofeld to covertly attend his meeting that Ash would double-cross him at, destroying the operation, Spectre, and Bond also has a personal vendetta against him for killing Felix, who has always been a close companion for Bond, working overseas as his counterpart, and they had a close camaraderie together. Primo is a little more passive and lacks a classic Bond henchman gimmick that most Bond henchmen have, though obviously Ash has the cyborg eyes, but honestly they should have just brought Jaws in on this one, am I right, fellas?
To be eliminated.
Finally, you have Urbachev, who is the scientist who led the team that developed the nanites and secretly worked for MI6. He is pretty passive beyond being the MacGuffin maker guy. He is by no means, though, a misunderstood good guy, with him threatening to kill anyone with African DNA at the end of the film, something Nomi doesn't take very kindly to.
Do you know what time it is?
What?
Time to die.
No Time to Die hired prolific composer Hans Zimmer from a million projects, including The Lion King, Gladiator, Mission Impossible 2, Nolan's Batman trilogy, Dune, and more to do the music. And the music in this film is very Bondish. The title track, No Time to Die, was performed by Billie Eilish, who is a pretty famous pop star these days who takes her dreamy pop style to this film and actually merges it pretty well with the lineage of Bond songs from previous performers like Shirley Bassey.
There's just no time to die.
It's not my favorite Bond track. but it works pretty well, with a good opening graphic sequence that brings to mind Casino Royale, Dr. No, and more. It's a real callback heavy celebration of these opening credits scenes. It's not my favorite of all time by any means, but it's good and adds to that Bond opening credits canon pretty well. Much like the rest of Daniel Craig's era, the tone is a bit dark with lots of twists and turns, along with some perhaps melancholy flashes of hope throughout. Nomi takes on the 007 mantra and seems to be able to hold that role down pretty well. Bond has a child and Madeline seems safe, with much of the potential threats by the end towards her family resolved. Spectre's gone, Safin's gone. On the other hand though, Bond does die, but the audience is left with a lot of hope when leaving this universe that was created over 15 years ago. It's sad for sure, but not a bummer, since I don't think the ending was a wholly dark one. Sort of like when Judi Dench M dies at the end of Skyfall. She did what she needed to do, but thanks to her, the world and her country can move on. The world will keep spinning, and I think that was tapped into for Bond's death as well, and kind of a thesis that underlies his whole saga as James Bond. The editing in this film is solid. It was handled by Elliot Graham, who worked on some of the X-Men movies and Captain Marvel, along with Tom Cross, who did films like La La Land and Whiplash. This isn't fully an editing issue, and partially the responsibility of the scriptwriters and the nature of this Bond iteration, but the film would be very confusing for someone who didn't see or didn't retain much from Craig's previous 4 entries. I wish there were more subtle reminders of past events. I also think this is why Skyfall is the most well regarded of Craig's era, since it's the least confusing as a standalone film. It's not like these films only have a few characters and plot lines and are dropped bi-yearly. These films had weird releases, sometimes coming almost a half decade after the previous. Rarely were preceded by reissues at all, at least here in the US, and came several years apart, making the film for a casual fan hard to track unless you wanted to go back and have a quick marathon before checking it out. When I watched Spectre for the first time, I think the last time I watched a Craig Bond movie was Skyfall in the theaters, and I was pretty confused at points and didn't love that film upon my first watch. That would certainly have been a problem here if I hadn't grown an interest in this series and made my long retrospective of the rest of the series, as well as there's just so much going on with so many callbacks and so many characters that kind of all weave together with these interpersonal relationships that I'm sure, even with a pretty good understanding and familiarity with this series, I probably missed things that Bond diehards could talk about. Linus Sandgren handled the cinematography and worked on films like American Hustle and La La Land, more recently doing Babylon, and I think he does great work in all of his films. This movie looks very sleek and cool, with clear, well-shot action and really interesting shot composition in these beautiful places Bond visits, helped by really well-done color, correction, and effects. That foggy forest fight against Safin's men is one of the best-looking action scenes in the franchise. Go! And frankly is incredibly pretty. And also Safin at the start of the film when he came to kill Madeline and his mother was also very pretty. I think the cinematography of this film is so memorable, and the first thing that comes to mind when I think of the film, this is probably just an interesting coincidence, but the title No Time to Die was also used for a non-Bond film by the original director of Bond, Terrence Young, who directed quite a few Bonds actually, including Dr. No. I don't know if that's a coincidence or a bit of a nod, but the title also kind of calls back to the "We have all the time in the world" quote, which, you know, if you have all the time in the world, you should have no time to die. Kind of just clicks. It's kind of a cool title. I also thought this was kind of cheesy, but poignant when he tells Madeline she and her daughter have all the time in the world right before he dies.
You have all the time in the world.
Kind of a full circle moment for everything in the film. Sweet, if a bit melancholy, and perhaps a tad cheesy. This film has some messy aspects, and I think Casino Royale is still my favorite in this series, because as a film it acts perfectly as a standalone, and everything in that movie is just so fucking good. I think this film, like the other sequels of the Craig era, with Skyfall being mostly exempt, fall into the trap of being too connected with a story that ends up being a spider web of ideas that all seem to come back into play. It's a lot to juggle, and I know some fans are mad the film kind of tossed out the rulebook, so to speak, and killed Bond, but I think it's fine. I definitely think it stands out as a unique entry in the series. It's not like anything before. I mean, killing Bond, Felix, and bringing back a Bond girl, Bond having a kid, a new 007, these things are all big no-nos for some fans, and I can't hate on that logic if it's not what you're coming here for, but as an interconnected film coming before an inevitable reboot and following 24 other films in the mainline franchise, I'm totally cool with it, but I think the film is a good time and really good, despite it occasionally having some messy aspects. No Time to Die made $774 million, which in 2021 was a really solid haul, though it is off a production budget of $300 million, with an ungodly amount of fees for marketing and lateness, meaning it probably didn't make all that much, but shows the viability of the franchise, especially considering the fact it came out when the world was recovering from some unusual circumstances, as we discussed earlier. The film got an 83% on Rotten Tomatoes and a 68 out of 100 on Metacritic, which honestly isn't that bad. I figured it'd be a little more decisive, given the formula breaking and the hard to follow plot without some strong knowledge of the previous lore. Well, it's been a few years since No Time to Die released, and we don't actually know much about Bond 26 aside from the rumors and speculation. This shit is big business in the UK too, so I feel like the Daily Mail and other British tabloids put out the "Who's the Next Bond" articles constantly. Sort of like the American equivalent of the rampant superhero film and Star Wars film speculation. The biggest rumor floating around is Aaron Taylor Johnson, who has been a pretty big supporting actor, though failed to ever really get his footing in a long-term franchise, will be the lead of the next Bond film. He's done a Godzilla film, an Avengers film, 2 Kick-Ass films, and showed up in Tenet, but this might be his chance at real lasting stardom in a franchise that lasts multiple entries. I kind of found him boring the last 10 years though. I thought he was good in Kick-Ass, but I think him working his way up to this generic action star from skinny derpy action star of old kind of made him a bit lame to me, though I hope whoever they pick is good, and I'm sure they'll do a fine job. They really haven't picked an awful Bond yet. The trick is just find someone who has the confidence and stands out. And while I love the interconnected, complex post-9/11 Bond we got through Daniel Craig, I honestly wouldn't mind if they went back to more episodic Bond films. I think they could be made quicker if they don't have to orchestrate these large-scale and confusing productions, and I just love Bond and wouldn't mind seeing that side of him again for a little while. Though I will say my interest in Bond was piqued when I saw Casino Royale on a portable DVD player on the floor at my friend's house on a rented Blockbuster copy now almost 20 years ago, back in 2006 or 2007. Since then, I've seen most of these movies several times, and seen them all at least once, and grew a soft spot for the character. So it'll be really odd having my first new Bond since I really got into the franchise, and I have to salute Daniel Craig and the staff of these films for making consistently interesting Bond films for over a decade. Anyhow, we're caught up on the Bond films for now. Check out my old series review from a few years back if you want a 3-hour look into the series. I even touch on the non-Eon films and some other oddities. It's a good time. I can link it at the end here in my weird outro thing.